Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Future Ready Leadership. My guest today, William Green, mega best-selling author of Richer, Wiser, Happier, How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and in Life, translated into 26 languages. And Charlie Munger, the late Charlie Munger, calls it one of the best investment books ever written. William, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm calling you from my study at home because my office has drilling in it, so you can see my chaotic bookshelves and stuff that look like they're about to fall on me from behind.
Well, we're redoing some of our bathrooms here, so I can relate to the drilling, the hammering, the dust, the dirt all over the house. So I can very much relate. Before we jump into some of the topics and themes, I thought maybe you can give us an overview of the book. I know you interviewed a lot of investors. So just kind of paint a very, very broad picture of what did you do as far as research for the book, and from a very high level, what is the book about?
Sure. The book is really about what you can learn from the greatest investors, not only about how to get rich, but actually about how to think better and more provocatively and counterintuitively, actually how you can live more wisely. Though sometimes living wisely is actually by realizing that they provide the worst example of how to live. So sometimes it's a cautionary example. And the book draws on hundreds of hours of interviews that I've done over the last 30 years with, I'd say, more than 50 of the greatest investors in the world. And so going back a long way as a journalist, I interviewed people like Peter Lynch or Jack Bogle, the guy who founded, the whole index fund movement and founded Vanguard. And I would go spend a day in the Bahamas with Sir John Templeton, who was probably the greatest global investor of the 20th century. And then I very specifically went back and interviewed some of the most important people I'd interviewed over the years for this book, and also a bunch of new people. And so there are a lot of billionaires in there, but then there are some more obscure people who are just incredible thinkers and incredible investors who are off the radar. And so what I was really trying to do was draw together and synthesize and distill the most important lessons from these investors, but really not just about how to invest and get rich, but actually how to deal with these quite philosophical questions like, if the future is unknowable, how the hell are you supposed to make decisions about the future? What do you do? And it turns out that the investors are actually an incredible group of people to study because they have so much skin in the game that they can't afford to be wrong. And so it kind of sharpens the blade. It makes them very, very incisive thinkers. So over the years, I just discovered that these were some of the smartest, wisest, most thoughtful people I'd ever encountered. And I just wanted to distill everything I had learned from them. So it was a somewhat crazy, overambitious project that took me 5 years without a vacation, much to the dismay of my wife.
Well, it paid off. I mean, the book has thousands and thousands of reviews on Amazon, 26 languages. It became a mega bestseller. So the 5 years, I guess looking back, your wife is now saying it's okay. It was worth the time and the effort.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of madness to anything that you do that's actually really worth doing. Look, it's a little bit like having kids. I don't know if you have kids.
I have two, yep.
So if you knew just how painful and difficult and stressful and emotional it would be, you might never do it. And so maybe
we're really selling up the benefits of having kids, how painful it is. But have kids.
I mean, it's the greatest joy as well. But at the same time, I think if you embark on setting up a new business or setting up a podcast or anything, like maybe we just actually have to be obtuse and stupid to go into it in the first place, because if we actually knew what it would entail, we would never do it. And so there has to be a kind of madness and a faith that you can pull off this incredibly difficult thing. And there was a moment, probably about 2 or 3 years into this process, where I remember just feeling so kind of broken and dismayed. And I remember sitting on the floor of my kitchen with my head in my hands, and my daughter, who was then a teenager, then 15 or 16, really comforting me and giving me a pep talk to kind of guide me through. So actually, this is one reason to have children, is that when you're broken and lost, they're the ones who can kind of give you pep talks and parent you.
Yes, unless they're like my kids, a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. Although sometimes they try to give me little pep talks, which is kind of funny. But when a 4-year-old tries to be very serious, but they don't have all the words to do it, and they kind of look at you with a stern face, it's pretty darn funny.
Huh.
So I think the really interesting thing is when a lot of people think of investing, they think of just kind of the stock market, right? They think of mutual funds, index funds, stocks, etc. But we forget that we're all investing every day in our lives, right? You invest in relationships, you invest in the company that you're a part of, you invest in pretty much anything and everything. And so as I was going through your book, I thought there were a lot of really interesting concepts that are, perhaps applicable to the business, the finance world, the world of finance, but they're also very relevant to just how we invest in ourselves, in our relationships, in our families, in our friends. Because to me, when I think of investment, I basically think of it's a choice. And we're all making lots of choices every day. So how do you figure out what the best choices are? And so I thought we could approach it from that angle.
Yeah.
But before we go down that direction, I have a very random tangential question for you, because I heard that recently you've been quite obsessed with mysticism, with Kabbalah, with Stoicism, with Buddhism, studying all these different kind of philosophical concepts. So I'm curious why. What is the... And from the investors that you've spoken with, it seems like a lot of them are working on their mindset, mentality, some of those components too. What's the relationship?
It's very deeply connected to the book, because really what I'm trying to do in the book is figure out how to live. I'm trying to figure out how in a world that's changing all of the time, right? Which is a great Buddhist truth, right? I mean, we live in a world that where everything is changing constantly. How on earth are you supposed to find some degree of equilibrium, some degree of peace of mind within this maelstrom? And that question has great ramifications, both for investors and business people and just in regular life, right? Because I think it was the Buddha said something like the world is a house on fire or something like that. And we've seen that with California recently, right? With the fires. Somehow we're having to construct lives where there's a degree of equilibrium and equanimity amid fires, amid tsunamis, amid economic or political crises or wars or pandemics. And in some ways, when you think of the markets, when you think of financial markets, there's also tremendous volatility, right? They're driven by fear and greed, fear of missing out, all these emotions. So it's an extraordinary advantage, competitive advantage, if within that maelstrom, you can keep your equanimity. Yeah. So a lot of the great investors turn out to be really pretty serious about meditation. So this morning, as on most Friday mornings, I spent a couple of hours talking with 3 investors who I meet with every Friday morning, basically. And we study a particular Tibetan Buddhist teacher who teaches us, and we discuss her teachings. And one of the reasons is that we've sort of figured out that actually part of having a really rich and abundant life is having close friendships, having that support, being able to tell the truth to each other about what we're dealing with, what we're going through, and also kind of supporting each other as we try to figure out how to elevate and become a little more enlightened and a little kinder and more compassionate. And that's been a huge gift to me. And I think most people would be shocked if they realized just how successful these people were and just how much attention they spend on actually trying to make sure that their inner landscape is okay. And I think for your listeners, a lot of whom are running businesses or starting businesses or executives, I think we all sense that if all we're doing is working and climbing the ladder professionally and building financial wealth and building our brand and the like, something is missing. That if our inner landscape isn't taken care of, it's pretty empty. So I write about this a lot in the epilogue of my book, where I say, okay, so here are all these great investors I've interviewed. And in some ways, they've hit the jackpot, right? These are people who have yachts and planes and mansions all over the world. And so they're a great cohort to study, to say, well, so what actually makes you rich? Like, is it that stuff that makes you go rich? And there's one guy in the epilogue who I talked to who got incredibly depressed while he was at his absolute pinnacle as a hedge fund manager. He said he was clinically depressed. And so part of what it is, I think, one of the lessons is that it's so not about the money, right? I mean, the money does give you something. It gives you a degree of freedom to live in a way that's aligned with who you are, with what's most important to you. But it's not the toys and baubles that matter. It's not the yachts and planes. And so if you're not living in a way that's aligned with what you care about, with your values, if you don't have good friendships, good relationships, it's really problematic. And when I interviewed Charlie Munger, who was Buffett's partner, who was 99 when he died, just 34 days short of his 100th birthday, when I asked him what we could learn from him and Warren about how to have a happy life, he immediately started talking about relationships. And he said, look, it's really simple. He said, we have a really simple strategy. He said, if you want to have a good partner, be a good partner.
Yeah.
And likewise, if you want to have a good spouse, deserve one. So I think when someone as wise as Charlie is saying to you, focus more on your relationships, dude, because if you get to the end of your life and your relationships are no good, you're really in trouble.
So I actually had a chance to go to Tibet many, many years ago. So I was in China. I spent a month in China, and then from China, we went to Tibet for a few weeks. And it was just really cool to see, what was it, the Potala Palace, I believe it's called. So kind of going in there, seeing a lot of those interesting sights. But just hearing you talk about relationships, two particular stories came to mind. One, I was just talking to my grandmother recently, and she lives in Australia, and she was telling me about this old family friend, somebody that I haven't seen in probably, 30 years, but or probably 35 years, but when we were very young, we used to play together when I would go visit her. And she was telling me how rich and successful this person has now become, and he has this gorgeous and beautiful house and lots of cars and stuff like that, but he's not very happy. He's single, he doesn't have any kids, he doesn't have a spouse, he's a little bit lonely. And so really, but he's, mega millionaire. And it just kind of goes to show that it's not just the money and the dollars and cents. And then a second story, a personal one, happened with some good friends that we had. And we had a misunderstanding about something, and my family was upset about it. Their family was upset about it. And we ended up not talking for around 2 months. And they lived next to us. We would see each other. It would be very awkward. Our kids go to school. We would ignore each other. It was just very, very unpleasant. And then finally, after 2 months, we ran into each other, the husband and I. And, it was very confrontational, very aggressive. And it was just like hours of me talking to him. And then I was talking to his wife. And it was just a whole big thing. And I realized that we weren't kind of getting anywhere. And it was this sort of tit for tat, right? Well, you did this. Well, but you did that. But you did this and you did that. And finally, I look at the husband and I'm like, look, I don't care. I don't care. This is so stupid. And I said, if there's anything that I did to upset you, I'm sorry. And then he said that to me. We gave each other a big hug. And that was it. And I looked at him afterwards. I said, I'm so glad we talked about this now, because how weird would it have been if we didn't see each other in like 40 years, right? You moved away somewhere, and then one day we're 80 years old and we see each other and we say, hey, what was that argument that we had 40 years ago? And he would say, I don't remember. And I would say, I don't remember either. And we would have wasted all this time. And so we kind of made an agreement between our families that regardless of what happens in the future, the what doesn't always matter as much as how the other person feels. And so we kind of made a commitment that regardless of what happens in the future, we're just going to say sorry to each other, right? If you see the other person's upset, life's too short. These relationships matter more than anything else. And they were our really good friends. Our kids were friends. So hearing you just talk about the importance of those relationships and connections really made me think of that. And we're both, our families are so grateful that we were able to just kind of patch things up over something so stupid. But just the act of being able to say I'm sorry and having that humility, went a long way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, because actually I'm going through a painful conflict with someone at the moment, so this is very much on my mind. So I think this is one reason why I become a little bit less just purely rational and scientific and stuff, and why I become more mystical, is that I do think you're constantly kind of getting, if you're open to it, you're getting messages from people who are trying to share things with you that are really helpful.
Yeah.
So part of it is, it's not that I don't value the rational stuff. I mean, I spend my time interviewing the world's most rational people, but I think we're given tools like intuition as part of our arsenal, and you don't want to shut that off because you're so busy crunching everything intellectually. And I came from this very intellectual background, right? I went to Eton, which is this famous English boarding school where a couple of the last British prime ministers went. I think there were more than 20 British prime ministers went there. and then I went to Oxford, and then I went to Columbia. And so there's really like this tendency to think I'm just going to crunch things with my brain. And I think often just going through life and trying to be more open-hearted is really helpful. And right before we started this conversation, I do this thing that's kind of crazy, where there's a beautiful ancient book written in Aramaic called the Zohar. And I play what I call Zohar roulette, and I just sort of open it randomly. And so I opened it right before we started just to read a passage. And literally the passage that I read, it's about seeing with the heart. And it says, it's about, being able to see. It says, the wise man who perceives with his heart is better. And it says, and in the hearts of all that are wise-hearted, I have put wisdom. And so it's sort of like, it's like I don't just want to see and believe my senses. It's like I also want to have kind of an open heart. And I see that with a lot of the great investors, is that the happiest ones, they're not just masters of making money. They're also thinking about how they can lift up other people, right? They're thinking about how they can share their wealth, their knowledge. And Charlie Munger used to say that the greatest thing that one person could do for another person was to share knowledge. And he spent enormous amounts of time in the last years of his life just teaching random people. I remember once going to a meeting that he had when he was chairman of the Daily Journal Corporation. I went to California for this meeting, and I went for an interview with him right after he'd done a private board meeting. And then he comes out and he does something like 2 or 3, I think it was 2 hours of answering questions from the audience. And then he spends another 2 or 3 hours with a whole group of us, like about 15, 20 of us, just gathered around him asking him questions. And at the time he was 93 and he could only see out of one eye, and he had terrible eyesight in that eye. And, I literally had to help him down off the stage because he was so sort of battered and worn. And I just remember looking at him and thinking, here's this guy who's, the absolute pinnacle of his game, multi-billionaire, falling apart physically, right? Like he was like this withered body in this big baggy suit, and with these huge kind of Coca-Cola bottle eyeglasses, and could barely see. And he just wanted to share wisdom and encourage these younger people who come from all around the world to see him. And I think that was a big part of why his life was a success. So part of what I'm doing is I'm looking at these great investors who are also great businessmen, and I'm saying, what actually constitutes a rich and abundant life? Like, what is it that I want to reverse engineer in their lives? And so there are ways of thinking that help you to build wealth, right? I mean, there are smart ways of thinking and dumb ways of thinking, and you want to reverse engineer that and clone what they're doing.
Yeah.
But you also want to look and say, well, so the ones who've just made a fortune and are miserable, what did they do wrong? And usually what it is, I think, is people focusing so much on their own needs and interests end up being pretty miserable. And the ones who are focused on helping other people tend just to be happier. So there's a degree of enlightened self-interest, I think, in figuring out how are you going to lift up other people along the way.
CHROs just like you have been telling me that they want a community of their peers, but specifically focused on the future of work and employee experience. I've been hearing this for around 10 years, and now I'm finally putting something together. It's called Future of Work Leaders. It's a collection of 100 of the world's top CHROs moving beyond traditional HR, specifically focused on the future of work and employee experience. I took everyone's feedback. I heard what CHROs just like you wanted. They don't want to spend a ton of money. They don't want speeches. They don't want upselling or cross-selling. They don't want any fluff. They just want to connect with their peers to focus on strategy, on insights, and on solving real-world problems, and on helping their organization become future-ready. So if that sounds like something you are interested in, check out futureofworkleaders.com. You'll be joining CHROs from brands like Dow, Lego, Neiman Marcus, Johnson & Johnson, and dozens of others. Again, it's futureofworkleaders.com. I can promise you, you will be glad that you checked it out, and I hope to see you in there. It's funny what you mentioned you do with your book. There's a book by a philosopher called Baltasar Gracian. It was a book written in, I think, 1606 or 1620. And I sometimes do that too. He wrote a book called
I bought it recently. It's
The Complete
on,
Man. The Complete
I got
Man, it's
another.
called.
He had, yeah, there's some because
The
he
Art of
talked
Worldly
about
Wisdom is
worldly
his other one.
wisdom, right?
Yep.
Which Maynard Keynes talked about, and then
Yes,
Charlie
also
Munger
a great
used the
book.
phrase.
Yeah, I like The Complete Man a little bit better just because it's drafted more into stories, whereas The Art of Worldly Wisdom are very short kind of quips. And it's hard to read that as a book where you kind of go through 10 of them in a day or something like that. But the art or the Complete Man is actual stories, and you can kind of go through a chapter in each day. And so sometimes I do that too. And it's actually, that book really helped me in kind of this relationship we had with the family, because one of the things that he talks about in the book is he says it is a gift to find people who have your intellect, your character, your alignment, your values, but it's truly an art to know how to keep those people in your life.
Huh.
And so as I read that book and I was thinking, I like that passage would constantly go over in my head, and I would say, well, okay, we clearly have this rift, and it's an art to know how to kind of repair it and fix it. And when you were talking about this idea of, mysticism, it's funny you mentioned that, because the way that we ended up bumping into each other is I was walking my dog, he was walking his dog, and I saw him, our streets, so kind of like a T, and he was walking down his street, and I was walking across. And so I saw him walking down the street, and I kept walking, and I literally felt like something grabbed me and pulled me and told me to turn around and go walk down his street. So he's walking away from me. I walk past him, then I turn around, I start walking down his street. And then all of a sudden, so he's walking away from me. He doesn't know I'm behind him. And all of a sudden, he turns around, looks at me, and starts walking towards me. And after we had this, back and forth and we figured everything out, I said, why did you turn around? I said, you didn't even know I was behind you. Why did you randomly turn around and start walking towards me? He's like, I have no idea. He's like, something just pulled me to walk towards you in that direction. So it's very weird and serendipitous that sometimes you don't have explanations for why things happen, but they happen the way they do. And I think
I have more and more trust in that.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to be sort of atheistic and very highly rational and kind of very dismissive in a very closed-minded way. And I write about this in the chapter about Sir John Templeton, who had, made billions of dollars and was this legendary investor. And then he decides in his, when I interviewed him, he was in his 80s, and he was trying to increase what he called spiritual wealth 1,000-fold. And so he would be funding all of these experiments at Harvard and the like on whether prayer worked. And I went and interviewed him as this sort of cocky young 30-year-old jaded journalist. And he says to me, yeah, so we're going to explore, like, does the prayer work if you have your hands on them, or if they're further away from you? Does it work if you say, thy will be done? Or is it better if they pray or if you pray? And I remember just looking at him like, he's kind of a moron, this weird guy. And at a certain point, I think years later, when I was working on this book and I was writing it, I realized, there are all of these things that he was trying to teach me that I was just too close-minded to listen to. And in a way, I feel like I've been in this kind of argument in my head with Templeton for the last 20 years because, and there's actually a moment that one of his books, I think he wrote a book called Worldwide Laws of Life or something like that, or Lessons from Worldwide Religions. And I remember reading it a few years ago and literally groaning out loud at one point and blushing because I realized how stupid and obtuse I'd been. And I was like, here I am, I've been studying, Proust and Nabokov and Joyce and stuff and congratulating myself on my intellect. And there were these like small lessons that he was trying to teach me about kindness and compassion and love and mercy and things like that I was just like, I was too cynical to hear. And so it's not that I'm trying to proselytize in any way. I think in a way what I'm actually trying to do is say, we know so little. I mean, there's a beautiful line that I think I quote from the 15th or 16th century French philosopher Montaigne, who had a chapter in one of his books that was something like, it was basically about, the one thing I know is that I know nothing, and I'm not even sure about that.
I know that quote. It's a great quote. It's interesting. It's almost like the older, and I wonder if this happens a lot as people get older. I mean, I'm not like 70 or 80, but even in my 30s, I think it happens because as you look back on your life and you kind of see how pieces come together, like as you can make those kind of connections, like, well, if it wasn't for that, this wouldn't have happened. You start to kind of believe and embrace things, right? So, even at my age, in my 40s, I kind of look back and I connect pieces like, well, if it wasn't for that conference and that invitation, I would have never met my wife. If I didn't meet you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
when you look back at kind of the string of things that kind of got you to where you are, it's very hard to look at that and to say, well, I wonder if something wasn't, I don't know, there isn't some serendipity or some mysticism going on. Is it
Yeah.
really just
Yeah.
chance or coincidence? Because there's just too many apparently random things that connect to yield an outcome that it's hard to imagine. Like we had the fires here in California too, and my house was actually on the news. My community was on the news, and I remember, I was driving out and I put the video on Instagram so people saw it. But as we were driving out, it was just me and my brother, my wife, and my kids were already evacuated, so they didn't see this. But as we were driving out of our community, I called my wife and I said, we're going to lose our house. Because literally, as I'm driving out, the hill right next to us was all in flames. And I thought, there's no way this community is going to survive. And I called my wife and I literally said, the only way this house is going to survive if there is a miracle. I said, there is no way. Like, we're surrounded by flames. We drive over to my brother's house in Woodland Hills, and we're literally watching on the news as they're dumping fire and all this retardant and stuff on our house and in our community. And then somehow, miraculously, the house is fine. No homes in the community were damaged. And it's stuff like that I look back and I'm like, how else can you look back on that and not realize that it's, something, someone, it's just not possible when you're surrounded and everything is engulfed in flames and you can come back to your home and it's not touched. It's literally right as I was driving out, the helicopters came, the fire engines came. It's like right at that minute. So it's so weird and bizarre. But it's also really interesting that so many of the people that you interviewed have either a meditative practice or a spiritual component or a metaphysical component, because a lot of people think of successful investors and businessmen as ruthless, cutthroat, rip your head off, make money, they're callous, they don't have any emotion, they're not human. But the truth is that a lot of them are very spiritual. They take care of their body, their mind, their soul. So I'm curious if you can speak to that for a minute, because I'm really interested in how the perception came about, where it's almost like the American Psycho CEO versus the reality of so many of the people that you spoke with who have this completely other side that helps them.
Yeah, I kind of assumed that because they were so rational, that most of the great investors would be atheists or agnostics. And I think that's kind of true for quite a few of them. But then I was surprised, as you were, by how many of them actually had deep faith or were obsessed. Even if they didn't have deep faith, they were obsessed with these questions of integrity and a well-lived life and lifting up other people and the like. And I think we get this image in the media from shows like Succession or Billions and the like, that you have to be rapacious and cynical and corrupt in order to succeed. And I think I was talking about this with someone yesterday because I wrote about Howard Marks, and Howard Marks said to me, Howard Marks oversees about $202 billion, I think, and he's worth a couple of billion himself. And I wrote about him at some length in the book. And when I had Howard on the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast a couple of years ago, he said to me, we were talking about the principles of his company. And he said, look, as in this, what's probably the eighth and last innings of my life, I would hate it if people looked at me and they thought what a joke this guy was, or even worse than that, how corrupt or whatever. He's like, it's really important to me to be seen as having lived life well. And so he took great pride in the fact that he'd worked with his partner for 37 years and they'd never had an unkind word between them. Yeah. And so that's really interesting. It was really important to him that he had a good relationship with his son and his grandchildren and the like. And I think that's a form of wealth as well. And I quote this phrase somewhere in the book where there's a beautiful Buddhist phrase, the joy of non-remorse. And I think sometimes if you can look at your life and think, well, yeah, I screwed up in all these ways. I did all these stupid things and I betrayed this person, or I was disloyal, or I was immoral in this way, but I really worked at it. I really,
Yeah.
despite how flawed I am, because I'm human, I really tried to improve. And overall, I tried to be a pretty good person. I think there's some joy of non-remorse. There's a famous investor called Ed Thorpe who I interviewed, really legendary investor who's in his 80s, now he's in his 90s, when I interviewed him. And I said to him, do you have any regrets? And he said, I don't regret any of the principled decisions that I made. So that was really interesting. Like that, he sort of, I had this fantasy also that he and Howard Marks would say, yeah, actually it benefits you to be honest and honorable and it's better for your business. And they were like, yeah, long term that may be true. But Ed Thorpe said, no, I probably would have done better if I'd ripped more raw meat off the carcass of life. But he said, then you get to the end of your life and you've achieved nothing and you've just spent your whole life chasing the wrong thing. And you realize how empty your life is. And likewise with Howard, Howard said, yeah, I think in the short term, I would have made a lot more money if I'd been unethical. But he said, in the long term, it's better to do things the right way. And, to take the high road, as he put it. And he said, even if it's not, that's okay. Because when you look back and you want to be proud of the life that you've lived, if you've behaved in this rapacious way, what does that give you? But in practical terms, I think there's something really important here, which people like Howard Marks and Ed Thorpe and Charlie Munger, who are all obsessed with being ethical, that they can illustrate for us, which is that if you behave in this honorable way and you try to treat people decently and kindly and be a good partner, despite all of our flaws, because we're all deeply, deeply flawed, you attract a different type of person into your life. And so you attract this incredible group of people in your ecosystem who are much more likely to be trustworthy and honorable in your dealings with them. And Tom Gaynor, who's the CEO of Markel, where he is in charge of about 20,000 people, talked to me about this at one point. And I said to him, how do you avoid being taken advantage of? Like if you're so trusting and loving and kind and compassionate and the like. And he said, the key is to extend trust first, extend love first, and then see if it's honored or violated. And he said, if it's violated, then you know that you don't want that person in your ecosystem and you don't do business with them anymore. But he said, what happens is, at a certain point, you get this incredible ecosystem of what he called trust-based relationships. And I've seen that in the way that he behaves. I sometimes tell this story that I really love, where I had asked him to come speak at a private event in New York, and there was absolutely nothing in it for him. I mean, this was during COVID. He lives in Virginia, and he took a train for 6 hours, stayed overnight in New York, and came and did a 1-hour fireside chat with me at a private event for another investment firm where I was an advisor, and then went back on the train for 6 hours to Virginia later that day.
Yeah.
And it was just such a beautiful thing to do. It's such a kind thing to do. And as a result, Tom is surrounded by people who wish him well because he behaves that way.
Yeah.
And so
I had him on my
do
podcast.
think it's
Actually,
become a competitive advantage.
yeah, I interviewed him as well for a book that I was working on called Leading with Vulnerability. And so we talked a lot about that. Ray Dalio was somebody else who I interviewed in the book as well. So those are some very
Great.
very much recurring themes that have come up that I think are also echoed in your book and some of the stuff that you've worked on too. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to talk about mental models, because I know that's a big recurring theme in the book. And it's interesting because as I was going through some of the stuff that you wrote, some of these are also mental models that have come up just through interviews that I've done. And I realized that a lot of the CEOs or business leaders I've either interviewed or worked with or chief human resource officers have referenced these mental models, but they don't necessarily know that they are these mental models. They just kind of do it. And so I think you had a few of them, right? Circle of competence was in there, second order thinking, opportunity cost, confirmation bias. There's like a lot of mental models that are either explicitly or implicitly talked about in the book that I think are very, very relevant to investors, not just from a finance perspective, but kind of a business and life perspective. Are there any particular mental models that stand out to you in particular that are just as relevant in life and in business as they are in finance?
Yeah, I'll mention two. So the first, the whole idea of compounding is extraordinarily powerful. And so the question is, are there things other than money that you can compound? And once you start to say, oh, wait a second, so I can compound knowledge and wisdom, or I can actually compound good habits with my health or my diet or my exercise and the like, or with meditation, it totally changes everything, because what you start to realize is that one of the great sort of superpowers in life is actually this ability to harness dogged incremental progress over time. And so it's these little things, these little commitments, like the 10 minutes of meditation you do each day, or the 12 minutes, or the 25 minutes, or whatever, or getting on the Peloton for half an hour several times a week. And over many years, that compounds in extraordinarily powerful ways. So on the day, it doesn't seem like that much. But if you read a little bit every day over many years, very, very powerful. And so there are a couple of people who I write about in the book. One is a friend of mine, Guy Spear, and one is a friend, Ken Schubenstein. And they talk about the compounding of goodwill. And so there are these acts of kindness that they would do over many years that at some point just create this tremendous effect. Probably has something to do with Robert Cialdini talking about the reciprocation effect, where people see you being kind to them and they want to be kind back. So I think that's very powerful. So compounding, thinking about compounding in this very broad way is very powerful. But then I would also say that probably the single most powerful idea that I've got from studying the great investors in many ways is Charlie Munger's approach of inversion, where he would say, he takes this idea from 19th century mathematics from this algebraist called Gustav Jacobi, who famously said, invert, always invert. And Charlie, who is a great polymath, adapts it for investing and life and says, okay, so if you want to figure out, for example, how to be a great businessman, or how to be a great investor, or how to be a great boss, start by saying, how could I be a terrible investor, or a terrible businessman, or a terrible boss? And so you reverse the problem, you solve it backwards. You have to solve it forwards as well and say, what are the good things I could do? But by inverting, you identify these very obvious mistakes. And so he would look at, he gave a famous talk at a school in California once, where he said to these high school students, let me give you a prescription for guaranteed misery in life. And so he starts to talk about all the ways you could guarantee an absolutely lousy life, right? You become unreliable. You get addicted to drugs and alcohol. You don't live up to your word. It's a very powerful idea. It's in the book Poor Charles Almanac.
Yep, I'm reading that as we speak, which is why I recognize that story.
Yeah, so for me, that's a very helpful tool, just to say to myself, okay, so in this situation, what's the dumb move? And at least start with a sense of like, what could I do that would really screw up this situation, that would make it worse? And then what you start to identify is, okay, so let me lose my temper. Let me get carried away by my emotions. Let me look out only for my interests. Let me not think about the other person's point of view. And you can apply this in so many ways. I had Chris Davis, who's on the board of Berkshire Hathaway, on my podcast a few months ago. And Chris, who is very close to Buffett and Munger, said to me that he thinks of his life in 3 sets of 10,000 days. And he said, I'm into the last 10,000 productive days in my life. And he said, I applied Charlie's way of thinking of inversion. And I say, what could ruin the last 10,000 days? And so he said, so lousy health, lousy relationships. Those would be two really obvious things. So what can I do to increase the odds that my health will be okay and my relationships will be okay? So one of the things we're dealing with, and this goes back to what we were saying at the very start of the conversation, is we live in a very uncertain world where anything can happen, right? Where the fires can come and get our house at any moment. So it's not like we have control of the outcome, but there are ways in which we can stack the odds in our favor so that we're more likely to have a happy outcome. I mean, if you have insurance, if you drive carefully, if you get your medical checkups once a year, if you get vaccinated, if you are kind to people, if you're honest, you're increasing the odds of a happy and successful life. Whereas if you do stuff that's kind of dishonest or cruel, or you delude yourself or whatever, maybe you get away with it for a while. But at a certain point, I always think of this line from Nassim Taleb, who wrote in Anti-Fragile, that the fragile breaks with time. And so I think if you keep doing things that make you more fragile, sooner or later it comes and bites you in the arse.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I wanted to ask you really quick. Well, first, was there any other mental models that you wanted to make sure that we touch on?
No, I mean, there are so many, but I think those ideas of compounding and inversion are both hugely important.
Yeah, there was also one on kind of like the circle of competence, which came up in another interview. I can't remember who I was speaking with, but that theme of circle of competence came up again. I think it also came up in a book by Thomas Sowell that I was reading around circle of competence. That's a very relevant theme around who you put in that group.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a really important related issue to that. It's just different terminology for the same thing, which is really the way I think of it, which is one of the great lessons from Charlie Munger is you want to play games that you're equipped to win. And that's a different way, really, of saying stick to your circle of competence. It's to look, for example, when Charlie was giving career advice, he would say, you want to, if you're 5'3", you don't want to play professional basketball and compete against people who are 8 foot tall. He said, you want to find something where you have natural advantages and that you're really passionate about, that you're really deeply interested in. And so one of the most replicable or clonable things that you can take from the great investors is just the discipline and the self-awareness to play games that you can win and to avoid games that you can't. And so one of the things that I started to figure out is, well, these guys tend to be incredibly unemotional when it comes to making decisions about money and investing. Yep. They're looking at really in terms of probabilities. And I'm not incredibly unemotional. I'm pretty emotional. And I'm from a family of Jews who fled from Russia and Ukraine and Poland over the last century.
My family's the same.
Yeah, so I think we have built into us a lot of fear and a great sense of uncertainty that in certain ways is a great advantage, right? Because we maybe we saw the warning signs early. But there's also, which helped our families, our ancestors to leave. But there's also probably an inherited neurosis and fear. And I remember this guy, Chuck Acre, who I interviewed. I said to him once, yeah, I'm kind of a pessimist. I'm always waiting for things to fall apart. I'm less of a pessimist now than I was then. And he said to me, good luck with that. He said, that doesn't really work for investing. You can be skeptical. It's important to be skeptical. But you want to have some sense that the business is going to work out, that good things happen. And so just for me to know, okay, it's really hard for me to invest in things like Tesla or Amazon or anything else that's doing really well because I have this general skeptical, pessimistic assumption that everything's going to fall apart and that people get carried away by fads. So I literally have to outsource a big chunk of my investments to people I trust who are able to be much more rational and objective. And I was looking yesterday, and a friend of mine who manages part of my money has a big position in Tesla. I'm kind of glad that he does because he's able to be sort of dispassionate about it and be like, whereas I would just look at it pessimistically and nervously. And I also look at Musk and I sort of distrust him inherently, without much rationale for distrusting him. And so I think to some degree what you're doing is you're actually hedging against your own biases and blind spots by saying, okay, these are games that I'm not qualified to win. Let me find someone who's better qualified. Yeah. And one of Dalio's great strengths, I've had Dalio on the podcast a couple of times, one of his great strengths is that he's very honest about where he's weak and where he's strong. And he very consciously surrounds himself with people who are strong where he's weak. And so that's one of the great lessons from the great investors for me, is just to be self-aware about my own limitations and try to stick with games that I'm equipped to win.
Yeah. Before I hit record, one of the things that I was asking you about, which you helped me find the name of the fund, the Renaissance Technologies, and the name of the fund was the Medallion Fund, I believe, by Jim Simmons. And it was funny because until I looked this up, I didn't actually know that this was true. I've never heard of this. Probably most people have no idea about this fund or about Jim Simmons, but a lot of people considered him the greatest investor on earth. And I just pulled up the Wikipedia page here, but apparently he was returning more than 66% in annualized fees before fees and a 39% after fees during a 30-year lifespan from 1988 to 2018. So it's crazy that he had these massive, massive fees that he was charging. And after those fees were charged, he was still returning 39% a year. I mean, the fees to pay somebody 30% a year to manage your money is unheard of. I mean, most people are between the 1% to 2%. So I'm really curious, do you know anything about Jim or Renaissance Technologies or the fund or him or what made this particular fund or his approach so unique and so special? Because I know he was a mathematician. I know he didn't give a lot of interviews. He was a big recluse. But it's a very mysterious, I think, fund and a character. So I don't know if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, I never interviewed him. I was always fascinated by him. There's a group of these brilliant quants, right, who are surrounded by, hundreds of math PhDs and physicists and the like. And I'm friendly with a guy who was on a Zoom call the other day who works for a quant fund, and he's a theoretical physicist. And I looked at the whiteboard behind him and realized there wasn't a single thing I understood on the whiteboard except for the word alpha. There was literally nothing else. And so he's a theoretical physicist who now works for a quant fund. And so I do think there's a certain type of very bletchley kind of code breaker, the sort of people who would have, in a different generation, bless you, during World War II, would have been at Bletchley Park, breaking codes. And I have a feeling, if I remember rightly, I can't remember whether it was Jim Simons or D.E. Shaw, one of them literally was a cryptographer. I think it may have been Jim Simons. And so it is a certain type of mind that enables you to crack codes. I think they're able to take enormous amounts of data, and obviously Dalio was doing this at Bridgewater as well. They're spending hundreds of millions a year on research, as Dalio explained to me, and so they get these massive inputs of data that give them an edge in terms of analyzing short-term patterns, usually of the market, and capturing these very small shifts. I think the thing that's relevant for the rest of us is something that Ed Thorpe said to me. So Ed Thorpe also ran a hedge fund that never even had a losing quarter in 20 years. And he's also the guy who figured out how to beat the market at blackjack and then roulette. I mean, he's an incredible game player. He's the guy who figured out how to count cards. And so an extraordinary mind. And he said to me that he said, if I don't have an edge, I don't play. And so the way that he gave himself an edge in roulette was that he and this famous scientist called Claude Shannon, who worked at MIT and at Bell Labs, they invented the first wearable computer, which was basically the size of a cigarette pack. And Ed, who I wrote about in the introduction to my book, would activate this computer with the big toe in his shoe, and he could measure how fast the rotor wheel and the ball were going in the roulette wheel. And so he slightly improved his odds of seeing where the ball was likely to land. So he turned a game of total chance into a game where he had an edge because he had extra information. So what Ed said to me is, look, you get an edge by having extra information, by having extra knowledge. But then there are also things where you can get an edge by having a behavioral or emotional advantage, right? Like just being calmer than other people. So I said to him, how do I know if I have an edge? And he basically said, look, if you're having to ask that question, it's pretty certain that you don't have an edge. And so you really need to ask yourself as an investor, but also in business, what's my advantage here? Like, am I playing a game where I actually have an advantage? And so I think when I interview people on my podcast, say, or I interview people for a book or something, I kind of have some degree of advantage, right? Like I've interviewed people for 35 years. I went to these great schools where we learned to distill information and figure out questions, and then tackle difficult questions where there were no real instructions on how to do it. I have no emotional advantage when it comes to investing, and I have no advantage when it comes to building a business. And so just that ability to be really self-aware is I think hugely important when it comes to investing and life. Yeah. Just to look at yourself with self-honesty. This friend of mine, Jason Zweig, who's a great columnist at the Wall Street Journal, once wrote me an email. I think I quote in the chapter on high performance habits, where he said the thing that people like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett and Bill Miller, another legendary investor I write about, the thing that they have in common is this tremendous self-honesty. So they look at what they're good at, and then they really don't bother with almost anything else. And then they're just looking to get better and better at that thing they care about.
How do you balance, though, because this is a very common theme, and maybe we can end on this, balancing the data with the human stuff, right? Because even in the market, right? Let's say you have all the data in the world, but that would assume that everybody is rational, right? But what good is having all the data in the world if people aren't playing by rational rules, right? So it's sort of like, like in the game of chess, if you look at a lot of top grandmasters, they say that, like if they're playing blindfold games, for example, they'll say that it's easy for them to play blindfold against a harder opponent than it is an easier opponent, because a harder opponent is going to play rational moves on the chessboard. And so they're going to play openings, they're going to play moves that the chess player can visualize in their head. But what's far harder for them to do is to play against somebody who maybe doesn't really know how to play that well, because then they start making random moves on the chessboard, and then it's kind of hard for them to follow along where the moves are, because it's not where you would expect them to go. So whether it's in finance or in business, how do you balance the data that you have? And I think this is especially very relevant with something like ChatGPT right now, or any AI tool, where you can just go into any form of AI, ask it a question, and assume that the response that you get is the best decision that you make, and that is the path that you should take. But there's also, to your point earlier, room for intuition, for human judgment, for critical thinking, for kind of taking a step back and trying to ask, is this really the best choice? Is there, how is this data being collected? Is it accurate data? I remember there were several times I would even go to an AI tool and I would ask it to make me a graph or a chart. And I'll ask it to do something like, give me employee engagement data over the last 50 years and correlate it with, like productivity or something like that. And it'll give me this graph. And the graph looks very compelling. And then I would have to ask ChatGPT, is this based on real data? And it would say, well, actually, there's no data for the last 15 years, so I kind of had to make it up and extrapolate it. So you have to challenge the AI tools. You have to challenge the data for it to tell you that, it doesn't actually know. And I think this is a very, very interesting challenge and a problem going forward, is how do you balance the human piece, the emotional piece, the critical thinking piece, with here's what this AI software is telling me I should be doing.
Yeah, it's such an interesting quandary, right? Because clearly they're both really important. But I'm struck again and again by the power of the human stuff, these qualities like intuition. And I remember in this chapter that I wrote about Howard Marks saying to him at one point that I had this feeling whenever I was with him that I was with this most superior machine. He's like this incredible computer, this really brilliant guy. But he was also an artist in his youth. And when he went to Wharton, he actually tried to study fine art, and then they kicked him out of the class because he was at Wharton studying finance, and they were like, there's not enough room for you. And so I said to him, how much of what you do is rational? How much is intuition? And he said, I used to think it was all rational. And he said, now I think it's all intuition. And so he said that part of what he was doing was he would look at the market and at the kind of deals that were being done. And he would say, why would people be doing crappy deals like this? How come there's so much money flooding into things? I remember once I was interviewing him, I think it was in 2017, and he said, there are people buying these 100-year Argentinian bonds at this unbelievably low interest rate. And he's like, Argentina has defaulted 8 times over the last century or 200 years or whatever it was. And the next time I interviewed him in 2020, he's like, yep, they've defaulted a 9th time. And so there's this incredible pattern recognition where he's able to see, he's got this incredible data that he's taken in over a 40, 50-year investment career, but it's enabling him to look at the world in this kind of intuitive, impressionistic way and say, just how over-optimistic are people at the moment? How pessimistic are they? And that sense was so strong that during the financial crisis, when most people were absolutely panicked, he went to a meeting with one client and the money was just sort of flooding out of funds and everyone felt like the world was just going to melt down. And it was really close to melting down, the financial system. And he said, basically, he was explaining to this client, like, yeah, but that supposition is really unlikely. And in that situation, this would happen and we'd be okay. And he said every time he suggested this client would say, yeah, but what if it's worse than that? And then he rushes back to his office and he writes a memo on the limits of negativism and says, sometimes you have to be skeptical about the amount of pessimism that's out there. You don't have to be just skeptical about the amount of optimism. He said, sometimes a deal is too good to be true, but sometimes it's too bad to be true. And because he had this intuitive sense of people's behavior, he and his partner, Bruce Karsh, came back and they started investing $500 or $600 million a week for 15 weeks in a row in stuff that nobody else would touch. And so they ended up making $9 billion during the financial crisis because they had this intuitive sense combined with this pattern recognition that came from deep experience. And so I think it's some combination. It's not like you want the full range of traits. You wouldn't want just to have an intuitive mind, and you wouldn't want just to have a rational mind, right? You want both.
Yeah, you need to have both for sure. Well, I can't believe the hour already went by. We're already a couple minutes over. I feel like I could be talking to you for another hour or two, and we even barely got started into exploring some of the key themes from the book. But it'll be a good incentive for people to actually go grab your book and check out your podcast. So why don't you let everybody know where can they go to grab your book, to learn about your podcast, and anything else that you want to mention for people to check out?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. The book is called Richer, Wiser, Happier. And the subtitle is How the World's Greatest Investors Win in Markets and Life. And then, and you can get that anywhere. I mean, most people get it on Amazon. And the ridiculous thing is that the US paperback recently came out, but actually the hardback is cheaper than the paperback. So there's an arbitrage where on Amazon you can get the hardback even cheaper than the paperback. And there's a beautiful audio edition read by a guy called Raphael Korkil, who has a very posh English accent and usually plays Russian villains in movies and TV shows, but he reads the book really beautifully. So the audiobook has done really well. And then there's this website, williamgreenwrites.com, which has various information about me. And then the podcast is called Richer, Wiser, Happier as well. And it goes out on the feed of We Study Billionaires, which is a very successful podcast run by my friends Stig Broderson and Preston Pish. And but you can find the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. And it tends to be these very long interviews with great investors. So if you want to hear a 2-hour interview with a Ray Dalio or a Howard Marks or a Joel Greenblatt or a Bill Miller, but also some great authors, it's a very joyful form, and I can't tell you how much easier it is than writing books.
Yeah, it's easier to talk to people than it is to actually type everything down.
Yeah.
Well, William, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it.
It's been such a pleasure, and hope we'll get to meet in person before too long.
Yeah, likewise. That would be a lot of fun, and I hope everyone checks out your book and your podcast. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And my guest, again, has been William Green, and I'll see all of you next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Future Ready Leadership. If you want to get access to more content on how you can become future ready, make sure to subscribe to the newsletter. It's thefutureorganization.com/newsletter. And if you enjoyed this episode, please send it to somebody who you would like to see become a better leader. Thanks for listening or watching, and I will see you next time.